The bell above the door of Ruthie's diner rang at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, and Walter Reeves didn't look up. He never did anymore. 8 years of sitting in the same booth, facing the same window, had taught him that most sounds in this world meant nothing. Most doors opening led to strangers. Most footsteps belonged to people who weren't coming for him. He was wrong this time. He just didn't know it yet. Walter turned his coffee cup a slow half-circle on its saucer, the way he did every morning, watching the steam curl up and vanish. 61 years old, hands cracked and stained permanently at the knuckles from 40 years of engine grease that no soap had ever fully lifted. His flannel shirt was the same one he'd worn yesterday, and the day before that. There was no one left to notice, and even if there had been, Walter wasn't sure he'd have cared. The photograph was still in his jacket pocket. It was always in his jacket pocket. A girl, 19, laughing at something just out of frame, dark hair caught mid-toss by wind that no longer blew anywhere Walter could reach. Grace. His daughter. Gone 8 years this week, and the anniversary sat in his chest like a stone he carried without ever setting down. He didn't hear the woman come in until she was already 3 feet from the counter, and even then, he almost didn't look. It was the little girl's voice that caught him, small, careful, the kind of voice that had learned too early to keep itself quiet. "Mama, I'm not that hungry," the girl said. It was a lie. Walter had heard that particular lie before, in his own kitchen, a lifetime ago, when money had been thin and pride had been thick, and his own daughter had said almost the same words in almost the same practiced tone. "I'm not that hungry, Daddy." He'd learned, eventually, what that sentence really meant. It meant, "I don't want you to feel bad about the number on the check." He looked up. The woman standing at the counter couldn't have been more than 26. She wore a coat too thin for the October morning, and her hands, Walter noticed hands, always had, it was a mechanic's habit, were shaking slightly as she counted coins into her palm. Not shaking from cold. Shaking from math that wasn't working out. Beside her, a little girl, maybe 5 years old, stood gripping the hem of her mother's coat with one fist, and in the other hand she held a small stuffed rabbit missing one button eye. "It's okay, hon," the woman was saying to the waitress, a young girl named Katie whom Walter had watched grow up behind that counter. "We'll just get the one plate. She can share with me." Katie glanced toward the kitchen, uncertain, the universal look of someone who wanted to help and didn't know how without embarrassing the person in front of her. Walter didn't think about it. That was the strange part. Later, when he tried to explain it to himself, there had been no decision, no weighing of pros and cons, no internal debate about whether a stranger's dignity was his business. His body simply moved. He was out of the booth, standing at the counter, before his mind had caught up to his legs. "Put it on my tab, Katie," he said. "Whatever they're having. And bring the little one a hot chocolate too." The woman turned, startled, her cheeks flushing red in a way that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "Oh, no, that's really not necessary, we're fine, we just—" "I know," Walter said, and something in his voice made her stop. He wasn't looking at her exactly. He was looking somewhere past her, at a version of a morning 8 years gone, at a girl who used to sit in a booth just like this one and insist she wasn't hungry. "I know you're fine. Let me buy breakfast anyway. Man my age, I got nobody to spend a little kindness on some mornings. Do me the favor." The woman's eyes were wet before she could stop them. She blinked hard, looked down at her daughter, then back up at Walter, studying him the way people study something they're not sure they're allowed to trust. "That's real kind of you, mister," she finally said. "Real kind." "Walter," he said. "Walter Reeves." "Mia," she said. "This is Sophie." It was an ordinary exchange. The kind that happens in small-town diners 1,000 times a year and is forgotten by lunch. Walter would have forgotten it too, filed it away with the quiet satisfaction of a decent deed done and moved on with his coffee, except for one thing. The little girl, Sophie, turned to look at him then, fully, for the first time. And there, on the inside of her small wrist, peeking out from beneath the cuff of a jacket 2 sizes too big for her, was a birthmark. Pale brown, shaped almost like a teardrop tilted sideways. Walter's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He knew that birthmark. He had traced it with his thumb 1,000 times when Grace was a baby, back when he still believed the whole world could be held safe in two hands if you just held tight enough. It was in the exact same place. The exact same shape. He told himself it was nothing. Birthmarks weren't rare. The mind found patterns in grief the way it found faces in clouds. It was a mechanism built to keep the dead close, nothing more, nothing supernatural, nothing that meant anything. Walter had learned that lesson the hard way over 8 years of seeing Grace's face in every dark-haired girl who walked past his shop window, every young woman who laughed a certain way in a grocery store aisle. Grief lied. Grief was the best liar Walter had ever known. But his hand, when he set the coffee cup down, wasn't quite steady. "That's a real pretty rabbit," Walter said to Sophie, keeping his voice light, easy, the voice he used to gentle a spooked animal or a nervous customer worried about a repair bill. "He got a name." Sophie considered him for a long moment with the serious eyes of a child deciding whether an adult could be trusted. "His name is Bug," she said finally. Walter's chest went tight. Bug. That had been Grace's nickname for her own stuffed rabbit, decades ago, the one she'd carried until the ears wore thin and Walter's late wife, Carol, had to sew them back on twice. Grace had never told anyone that name outside their family. It was a small thing, a coincidence surely, the kind of name a 5-year-old might land on for a dozen innocent reasons, but it sat next to the birthmark in Walter's mind and refused to leave. He looked up at Mia, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite place. Not suspicion, exactly. Something more careful than that. Something that looked almost like fear wearing the mask of politeness. "You two just passing through Millbrook?" Walter asked, trying to sound like a man making conversation and not a man conducting an interrogation. "Something like that," Mia said. Her eyes flicked toward the door, then back. "We're staying a little while. Cousin's got a place outside town." It wasn't a lie, exactly, Walter thought, but it wasn't quite the truth either. He had spent 40 years reading the tales of men trying to talk their way out of paying an honest repair bill, and Mia had 3 of them stacked up in one sentence: the too quick answer, the eyes that wouldn't hold steady, the small, unconscious step she took that put her body slightly between Walter and her daughter. She was protecting Sophie. From something. Or someone. Katie set the plates down, eggs, toast, a small stack of pancakes for Sophie with a smiley face drawn in syrup, and for a few minutes the conversation dissolved into the simple mechanics of eating. Walter went back to his booth because he sensed that lingering would frighten her more than it would reassure her, but he didn't leave the diner. He nursed a second cup of coffee he didn't want and watched, in the reflection of the window, the way Mia kept glancing at the door every time the bell rang. She was scared of someone walking through that door. Walter would have bet his shop on it. When they finally rose to leave, Sophie clutching a small paper cup of hot chocolate in both hands like it was something precious, Walter caught Mia's eye one more time. "You need anything while you're in town," he said, reaching into his jacket, not the pocket with the photograph, the other one, and pulling out a business card, worn soft at the corners. "Reeves Auto Repair, Millbrook, Ohio. Car trouble, flat tire, anything. Or if you just need a place that'll feed the little one without a fuss. I'm 3 blocks that way, can't miss it. Big sign, ugly as sin, my late wife always said." Mia took the card slowly, like it might burn her, then held it against her chest for a second before tucking it into her coat. "Thank you, Walter," she said, and there was something in the way she said his name, full, careful, like she was memorizing it, that would come back to him later, in the dark, turning over and over. "You're welcome, Mia." He looked down at Sophie. "You take care of Bug now." Sophie nodded solemnly. Then, unprompted, she said something that would keep Walter awake for the next 4 nights straight. "My mama says rabbits remember the people who are kind to them," Sophie said. "Even after they're gone." Walter felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. "That's so," he managed. "That's what my other mama used to say," Sophie clarified, matter of fact, the way children explain things that adults find enormous and children find simply true. "Not this mama. My first mama." Mia's hand closed around Sophie's shoulder fast, gentle but firm, steering her toward the door. "Time to go, baby. Say bye to Mr. Reeves." "Bye, Mr. Reeves," Sophie said, waving Bug's paw at him. And then the bell rang again, and they were gone into the gray October morning, and Walter Reeves sat alone in his booth with his coffee going cold and a hole tearing itself open in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. My other mama. My first mama. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in Grace's old room, he still called it that, even though it had been 8 years since she'd slept in that bed, 8 years since the fight, 8 years since the last words either of them had spoken to each other had been ugly ones neither of them meant. He took the photograph out of his jacket and set it on the nightstand and looked at it until the lines of her face blurred with exhaustion and grief. Ran away. That's what the police report said. Eventually, after the first frantic weeks of searching turned into months, and the months turned into years, and the case grew a thin film of dust in a filing cabinet somewhere in the county sheriff's office. 19 years old, no signs of struggle, a duffel bag missing from her closet, a note that wasn't quite a note, just 4 words scrawled on the back of an envelope. I need to breathe. Walter had told himself that story for 8 years. His daughter had left because he'd been too hard on her, too rigid, too much his own father's son in the ways he never wanted to be. She'd left to breathe, and someday, when she'd breathed enough, she would come home, and he would apologize for every word he'd said that last night, and she would forgive him, because that's what daughters did, in the version of the story Walter allowed himself to believe on the nights the loneliness got bad enough to need one. He had never once let himself consider the alternative story. The one where she didn't come home because she couldn't. The one that ended somewhere he wasn't ready to look. But a little girl with Grace's birthmark, carrying a rabbit named Bug, talking about a mama who used to be hers, that wasn't a story Walter had written for himself. That was something else walking straight into his diner on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and he didn't know yet whether it was salvation or the beginning of the worst thing that had ever happened to him. He thought about driving out past the edge of town, to the cluster of rural addresses that might house a cousin's place, but stopped himself before he'd even gotten his keys off the hook. Mia had looked at that door like she was counting exits. Whatever she was running from, showing up unannounced at her cousin's house, assuming the cousin even existed, would only confirm to her that Millbrook wasn't safe either. Walter had learned enough about fear, secondhand, from 100 different customers with 100 different stories, to know that spooked people didn't come back if you chased them. So he waited. 2 days. 3. He went to the diner every morning at 6:47, same as always, and every morning the booth by the window stayed empty of anyone but him, and every morning the not knowing dug a little deeper. On the 4th night, at 11:40, someone pounded on the door of his house. Walter came down the stairs 2 at a time, heart slamming, some old animal part of his brain already certain, with no evidence at all, that this was it, this was the thing he'd been waiting 4 days for. He threw the door open without checking the window first, something Carol would have scolded him for even now, 8 years gone, and found Mia standing on his porch in the rain with no coat, her hair plastered to her face, and no Sophie in sight. "Where's the baby?" Walter started. "She's safe, she's with a neighbor, I didn't want her to hear this," Mia said, and her voice was shaking in a way it hadn't been in the diner, cracked wide open, the careful mask gone entirely. "Walter, I need to tell you something and I need you to let me say all of it before you say anything, because if I stop I don't think I'll be able to start again." Walter's hand tightened on the doorframe. Behind him, the house was dark and silent and full of 8 years of empty rooms. "Come in out of the rain," he said quietly. "And then you tell me." Mia stepped inside, dripping onto the hardwood, and for a moment she just stood there, hugging her own arms, looking at Walter with an expression he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget, an expression that held equal parts relief and dread, the look of someone finally about to set down a weight they'd been carrying so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "That birthmark you noticed," Mia said. "You weren't imagining it." The floor tilted again, the same way it had in the diner, except this time Walter had nothing to hold on to. "And Bug," Mia went on, her voice breaking. "She didn't make that name up herself. She was taught it. By someone who loved that rabbit's twin sister when she was a little girl herself, in a house not 3 miles from where we're standing right now." "Say it," Walter said. His own voice sounded far away to him, like it belonged to someone standing in another room. "Whatever it is. Just say it." Mia's eyes filled, and this time she didn't blink the tears back. "Walter," she said, "I need to tell you about Grace." And outside, the rain kept coming down against the windows, and somewhere 3 blocks away a little girl slept in a stranger's spare room clutching a rabbit with one button eye, not knowing that her whole world was about to be pulled up by the roots, and Walter Reeves stood frozen in his own front hallway, 8 years of silence finally about to break, with absolutely no idea whether what came next would save him or destroy him completely. Mia didn't sit down. She stood in the hallway with rainwater pooling at her feet, and she talked fast, like if she slowed down the words would turn solid in her throat and choke her before she got them out. Her name was Grace Reeves, Mia said. I didn't know her last name for the first year. She never used it. She called herself Grace Monroe, said it was her mother's maiden name, and I believed her because why wouldn't I? People run from things. You don't ask too many questions when someone shows up at a shelter with a duffel bag and eyes like she hasn't slept in a week. You just make room. Walter's legs found the strength to move him to the bottom of the stairs, where he sat down hard, because standing had become a project requiring more concentration than he had available to spend on it. A shelter, he repeated. Cedar House. Women's shelter, 2 hours north of here, up near Fort Wayne. Mia wrapped her arms tighter around herself. I was 17. Ran from my own mess, different mess, doesn't matter right now. Grace was 19. We ended up in bunks next to each other for 4 months, and in a place like that, you either stay strangers or you become family fast, because there's nothing gentle about the space in between. She was hurt, Walter said. It wasn't a question. Somebody hurt her. Mia's jaw tightened. She didn't talk about home much. Not at first. When she did, it wasn't about being hurt, not like you're thinking. She talked about being suffocated, those were her words. Said her daddy loved her so much he'd forgotten how to let her be a person instead of the last thing keeping him alive since her mama died. Said every conversation turned into a fight about what she owed him. Staying close. Staying careful. Staying his. Walter closed his eyes. He knew that fight. He'd started it more times than he could count, in the 2 years after Carol's cancer took her, when Grace was the only solid thing left standing in a world that had gone soft and unreliable beneath his feet, and he had held on to her the way a drowning man holds onto a person instead of a rope, too hard, in the wrong places, pulling them both under. The night she left, Walter said, we fought. I said things. She said things back. I told her if she walked out that door she needn't bother. He stopped. He had never said the rest of that sentence out loud to another living soul in 8 years. I told her she needn't bother coming back. She told me about that night, Mia said quietly. She told me almost word for word what you just said. She used to say it back to herself sometimes, in the dark, like she was testing whether it still hurt. It always still hurt. Then why? Walter's voice cracked wide open. Why didn't she come home? Even once it stopped hurting so bad. Why didn't she call? Mia was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to almost nothing. Because by the time it stopped hurting so bad, Walter, she was already pregnant. And scared. And she'd convinced herself that showing up on your porch with another man's baby was going to prove every terrible thing you'd ever accused her of being ungrateful for. She thought you'd see her as the daughter who ran off and came back broken. She wanted to come back whole. She kept saying, someday, when I've got it together, when I've got something to show him besides sorry. Walter put his face in his hands. 8 years. 8 years of a story he told himself about a daughter breathing somewhere out in the world, gathering herself, working her way back to him on her own time, and the truth was so much crueler and so much more human than that. She hadn't been avoiding him out of anger. She'd been avoiding him out of shame, the very same shame he'd have told her, if she'd only called, she never needed to carry. Where is she? Walter said, lifting his head. Mia. Where's my daughter? And here it was. The moment Mia had driven through the rain, left her own daughter with a neighbor, worked up 4 days of courage to reach, and Walter watched her face crumple the way a dam crumples, not all at once, but in one small collapsing piece that told you everything about the flood behind it. Walter, she said. Grace died. 14 months ago. The house went very quiet. Even the rain outside seemed to hold itself back for a second, waiting. There was a car accident, Mia said, and now she was crying freely, no longer bothering to fight it. Icy road, a delivery truck ran a light outside of Fort Wayne. It wasn't anybody's fault, it was just one of those terrible, senseless things. She held on for 2 days in the hospital. I was there. I was the only one who came, because I was the only family she had left that she'd let herself trust. And Walter, Mia's voice broke fully now. Sophie was 4 years old, sitting in a hospital hallway, and Grace made me promise her something in the last hour she had enough strength to talk. Walter couldn't speak. He simply looked at her, waiting, his whole chest one open wound. She made me promise that Sophie would know her grandfather, Mia said. Someday. When it was safe. She said. Mia pressed a shaking hand to her mouth for a moment before continuing. She said, "Tell my dad I forgive him before he even asks, and tell him I hope he can forgive me too, and tell him his granddaughter has his exact stubborn chin and it about killed me every day." Walter made a sound then that he hadn't made since the day of Carol's funeral, a raw, wrecked sound that came from somewhere below language, and he put his hands over his face and wept in his own front hallway while a stranger who had become, in the space of a single conversation, something closer to family than most people he'd known his whole life, stood dripping rainwater and grief onto his floor and let him. It was a long time before either of them spoke again. "Why did it take 14 months, Walter finally managed, wiping his face with the back of one grease-stained hand. "Why didn't you come sooner? Why the diner? Why the games, the coincidences, why not just knock on my door and tell me straight?" Mia's face changed then, the grief still there, but something harder moving in underneath it, something Walter recognized because he'd worn the same expression himself 1,000 times behind the counter of his shop when a customer tried to shortchange him. Wariness. Calculation. Fear with its spine straightened. "Because it's not that simple," Mia said. "There's someone else who wants Sophie. Someone who has more money and more lawyers than I will ever have in my life, and he has been looking for us since the week Grace died." "Sophie's father," Walter said slowly. Mia nodded, and something in her nod made Walter's stomach drop before she'd even said the name. "His name is Preston Vance," she said. "And Walter, I need you to understand something before I say anything else." Grace was terrified of him. Not the ordinary kind of scared you get after a bad breakup. The kind of scared that makes a person change her last name and cut off every friend she had before she landed at Cedar House in the first place. "I think," Mia's voice dropped even lower, glancing instinctively toward the dark front windows as though the name itself might summon something through the glass. "I think the reason Grace never called you, the real reason underneath the shame, was that she was trying to keep you from ever being connected to her again. So he couldn't find her through you. So he couldn't use you." Walter felt something cold slide down his spine that had nothing to do with the rain still dripping off Mia's coat onto his floor. "Use me how?" he said. "Use me for what?" Mia opened her mouth to answer, and that was the exact moment a pair of headlights swept slow and deliberate across the front windows of the house, pausing for 3 full seconds directly outside, before moving on down the dark, empty street. Mia went white. "That's the 3rd time," she whispered. "The 3rd time this week that same car has driven past somewhere I've been standing. Walter, I think he found us. I think he's already here." Walter was on his feet before he'd decided to stand, moving toward the window with the particular calm of a man whose fear has just converted itself entirely into purpose. He'd spent 8 years with nothing left to protect. That had just changed in the space of one conversation, and something in him, something that had been dormant, sleeping, waiting, came fully, dangerously awake. "Sophie's at a neighbor's house," Walter said. "Whose?" "2 streets over. Mrs. Halloran, she runs the daycare. I met her at the—" "I know Ruth Halloran," Walter said, already pulling his boots on by the door, his hands steadier now than they'd been in days, the way a man's hands go steady when there's finally something to do with them. "Get in my truck. Now." They didn't speak on the short drive. Mia sat rigid in the passenger seat, watching every side street, every parked car, every shadow that might or might not have been a shadow, and Walter drove with the calm, careful precision of a man who has spent 40 years fixing what other people break and has just decided that this, whatever this turned out to be, was simply one more broken thing that needed fixing, and he intended to be the one who fixed it. Ruth Halloran's porch light was on when they pulled up, and for one suspended second neither of them moved, both bracing for the worst kind of silence a house could hold. Then the front door opened, and Ruth stood there in a bathrobe with Sophie asleep against her shoulder, rabbit dangling from one small fist, and the whole world exhaled at once. "Everything all right?" Ruth called out, squinting against the truck's headlights. Little one's been sleeping like a rock, no trouble at all. Everything's fine, Ruth, Walter called back, and his voice only shook a little. Sorry for the hour. We're just heading home. Home, the word left his mouth before he'd thought about it, and it wasn't until they were back in the truck, Sophie buckled sleepily into the back seat still clutching Bug, that Walter realized what he'd said, and that he'd meant it, and that some decision had just been made inside him that he hadn't consciously chosen but that felt, all the same, like the first true thing he'd decided in 8 years. Mia twisted around in her seat to look at her daughter, checking her over the way a mother checks a child after a scare, cataloging every finger and toe against some invisible ledger of safety. Walter, she said quietly, once she'd turned back around, once the truck was moving again through the wet dark streets of Millbrook. I have to tell you the rest of it. About Preston. About why he wants her so badly. It isn't just about being a father who misses his kid. Tell me, Walter said. Preston Vance doesn't lose things, Mia said. Not property, not money, not people. It's not love driving him, Walter, and I need you to hear that clearly, because if you go into this thinking you're dealing with a broken-hearted father, you're going to make a mistake that could get all 3 of us killed. There's a reason his name doesn't show up on any custody filing anywhere in this state. There's a reason Grace changed her name and cut every tie and still wasn't safe enough. He has resources most people can't imagine, and he has never once, in his entire life, allowed anyone to walk away from him and simply keep walking. Then why haven't you gone to the police, Walter said. If he's dangerous. Because 2 officers in Fort Wayne take his calls personally, Mia said, and the flatness in her voice was worse than if she'd screamed it. Because the one time I tried, 6 months ago, someone called him before they called anyone who could help me. Because the system that's supposed to protect people like us is the same system his money moves through like water. I have been running for 14 months, Walter, and tonight I ran out of places left to run to. Walter pulled the truck into his own driveway and killed the engine, and for a moment the 3 of them sat in the settling quiet, rain ticking softly against the roof, Sophie's small breathing steady and even from the back seat. Then you're done running, Walter said finally. You're both staying here. In my house. Grace's old room still got a bed in it, still got her things in the closet, I never could bring myself to, his voice caught, and he pushed through it. It's got a bed. Sophie can have it. You'll take the guest room. And whatever this man thinks he's owed, whatever he thinks he can walk in here and take, he's going to find out that Grace Reeves's father isn't done fighting for his family. Not by a long shot. Mia looked at him for a long moment in the dim glow of the porch light, something shifting behind her eyes, relief, and something more complicated than relief, something that looked almost like the first stirring of hope she'd allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. You don't know what you're agreeing to, she said quietly. I know I buried a wife, Walter said, and I know I thought I'd already buried my daughter's memory of loving me, and I know that little girl asleep back there has got Grace's exact stubborn chin, and I know I am not about to lose the only piece of my daughter this world has left to give back to me. Whatever's coming, Mia, let it come. I've got nothing left to lose, and that makes me a lot more dangerous than your Mr. Vance is used to dealing with. Somewhere out past the edge of Millbrook, on a dark stretch of county road that neither of them could see, a black sedan idled at a crossroads with its headlights off, a man in the driver's seat scrolling patiently through a private investigator's report with a photograph clipped to the corner, a photograph of a little girl with a rabbit and a birthmark shaped like a teardrop, taken through a diner window 4 days earlier, time-stamped, catalogued, and waiting. He was in no hurry. Preston Vance had never once in his life needed to hurry to get what he believed belonged to him. And inside the small house on Maple Street, as Walter Reeves carried his granddaughter's small sleeping body up the stairs to a room that still smelled, faintly, impossibly, like the daughter he'd lost, he had no way of knowing that the real danger hadn't arrived yet at all, that everything so far had only been the quiet part, the calm laid carefully over a storm that was still gathering strength somewhere out in the dark, waiting for the exact right moment to break. The first sign came 3 days later, and it wasn't subtle at all. It was a business card. Walter found it tucked under the wiper blade of his truck outside the shop, right in the middle of a Thursday afternoon with customers coming and going, right there in broad daylight where anybody could have left it and anybody could have watched him find it. Cream-colored cardstock, heavy and expensive, the kind of paper that announced money before you'd even read the words printed on it. Asterisk Preston Vance. Vance Capital Holdings, asterisk, and beneath it, in smaller type, a phone number and 4 handwritten words that made Walter's hands go cold in the middle of an otherwise warm afternoon. Asterisk, we should talk. Soon, asterisk. He didn't tell Mia right away. He sat with it for an hour, turning it over on his workbench between customers, and it was Ruth Halloran, of all people, who noticed something was wrong when she stopped by to drop off a casserole and found Walter staring at a piece of cardstock like it might detonate. That doesn't look like good news, Ruth said. It isn't, Walter admitted, and told her enough of it, not all of it, not Grace, not the shelter, not the 14 months of running, but enough that Ruth's easy expression hardened into something protective and Millbrook stubborn. You call Sheriff Danby, Ruth said. Today. Not tomorrow. Walter did call, that evening, sitting at his kitchen table with Mia across from him and Sophie asleep upstairs in Grace's old bed. Sheriff Tom Danby had known Walter for 20 years, had bought his own patrol truck's tires from Reeves Auto Repair a dozen times over, and he listened to the whole story without interrupting, his face growing grimmer with every sentence. I can't arrest a man for leaving a business card on a windshield, Danby said finally, apologetic and frustrated in equal measure. But I can run his name. And Walter, I'm going to have a car swing by your place a few times a night. That much I can promise you. It wasn't enough. Everyone at that kitchen table knew it wasn't enough, but it was something, and something was better than the nothing Mia had been surviving on for 14 months. The call came 2 days after that. Walter answered his own phone at the shop, wiping grease off his hands onto a rag before he picked it up, and the voice on the other end was smooth in a way that made the hair on Walter's arm stand up before the man had even finished his first sentence. Mr. Reeves. Preston Vance. I believe you're currently hosting something that belongs to me. She's not a something, Walter said. And she's not yours. She's my granddaughter, and her mother's got full legal custody, and you're not welcome anywhere near either one of them. Full legal custody. Preston's voice carried the particular amusement of a man who had never once in his life lost an argument he cared about winning. Mr. Reeves, I don't think you fully understand the situation you've stumbled into. Grace never told you much about me, did she? That was rather the point. But let me be direct, because I respect a man who works with his hands and doesn't care for games. I have resources you cannot begin to imagine, and lawyers who have never lost a custody dispute in this state. I don't want a war. I would very much prefer this stay civilized. But I will have my daughter, Mr. Reeves, one way or another, and I would strongly advise you to be on the right side of how that happens. Get off my line, Walter said, and hung up before his voice could betray how badly his hands were shaking. That night, lying awake in his own bed listening to the old house settle and creak, Walter did something he hadn't done in 8 years. He went back through the box of Grace's things he'd never had the strength to sort, photographs, report cards, a half-finished friendship bracelet, the small archaeology of a childhood cut short, and this time, instead of letting the grief close the box again, he made himself look. Really look. For anything, any scrap, that might explain what she'd been running from and why she'd been so certain that changing her name wasn't protection enough. He found it near the bottom, folded into eighths, worn soft at every crease like it had been carried and unfolded 100 times before finally being put away for good. A letter Grace had never sent. Dated 18 months before she died. Dad, it began, and Walter's throat closed up just reading the word. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to mail this, but I need to write it down somewhere or I think I'll lose my mind. Asterisk Preston isn't who he seemed like at first. I met him at a job I took in Fort Wayne, and for a while it felt like being seen for the first time in my whole life. But there's a version of him nobody sees until it's too late, a version that keeps track of everything, that needs to know where you are every hour, that turns, I love you, into a leash if you're not careful. I found out 3 months ago that he's done this before. There was a woman before me. She has a restraining order. I found the court filing by accident, going through a box in his study I wasn't supposed to touch, and Dad, she said in her filing that he told her if she ever left, he'd make sure no court in the state ever let her keep the baby. He has that much money. That much reach. I believe her, because I've seen what he's capable of when he doesn't get exactly what he wants, asterisk. Asterisk I'm pregnant, Dad. I found out 2 weeks ago. I haven't told him yet and I don't know if I ever will, because the second I do, I stop being someone he loves and start being someone he owns. I'm scared. I miss you so much it physically hurts some nights. I know what I said when I left, and I know what you said back, and none of it matters anymore next to how much I wish I could just call you and hear your voice and know that somewhere in the world there's still a person whose love for me doesn't come with a leash attached, asterisk. Asterisk I'm going to disappear for a while, Dad. Not from you, I mean, yes, from you too, I'm sorry, I know how that sounds, but from him, mostly. I have to. If I have this baby and he finds out, I don't think either of us will ever really be free again, asterisk. Asterisk I love you. I never stopped, not for one single day, no matter what I said in that fight. I hope someday I get the courage to send this. I hope someday you get the chance to meet her, I already know it's a girl, don't ask me how, mothers just know, and I hope when that day comes, you'll understand why I had to stay away so long, and you'll forgive me the way I already forgave you a long time ago, asterisk. Love, Grace. Walter sat on the floor of his daughter's old bedroom at 2 in the morning and read the letter 4 times through tears that didn't stop, and when he finally set it down, something inside him had changed shape permanently. This wasn't a man defending an abstract idea of family anymore. This was a father reading, 18 months too late, the very words his daughter had been too afraid to send him while she was still alive, words that told him exactly what kind of man was now circling his house at night with headlights dimmed, exactly what that man had already done to one woman, and exactly what he intended to do to Mia and Sophie if he ever got the chance. He brought the letter to Sheriff Danby the next morning. Danby read it twice, his jaw working, and then made a phone call right there in front of Walter to a detective he knew in Fort Wayne. The detective's name was Renata Cruz, and what she found, over the following week, cracked the case open in a way none of them had expected. The restraining order Grace had mentioned was real. So was the woman who'd filed it, her name was Denise Okafor, and she'd spent 3 years fighting Preston Vance through the family courts for custody of a son Preston had fathered before Grace ever met him. Denise had lost. Not because the evidence hadn't been there, but because, as Cruz discovered digging deeper, 2 family court judges in the district had financial ties to Vance Capital Holdings that had never been properly disclosed. It wasn't just intimidation. It was a system Preston had spent years quietly buying his way into, one favor, one donation, one carefully placed friendship at a time. But that wasn't the twist that changed everything. The twist came from something smaller, something almost accidental, a detail Cruz found buried in the accident report from the night Grace died. The delivery truck that struck Grace's car on that icy road outside Fort Wayne 14 months ago had been cited for a mechanical failure. Brake lines. Worn, the report said, consistent with age and poor maintenance. Ordinary, tragic, unremarkable, the kind of accident that happens on icy roads to careless companies that skip inspections. Except Cruz, running the truck's registration out of habit more than suspicion, found that the delivery company was a shell corporation. And the shell corporation, 3 layers down through a chain of holding companies designed specifically to be difficult to trace, led back to a private investment fund. Vance Capital Holdings. Walter received this news sitting in Sheriff Danby's office with Mia beside him, and for a long moment neither of them could speak. The accident that had taken Grace from them, the senseless, nobody's fault accident Mia had grieved for 14 months, might not have been an accident at all. Preston Vance had found Grace before she died. He had known where she was. And 10 days before the crash, phone records showed, a call had gone out from a number registered to one of his associates to the dispatch office of that exact delivery company. We can't prove intent yet, Cruz said carefully, watching both their faces crumble and reassemble in real time. This could still be coincidence stacked on coincidence. But it's enough for me to reopen the accident as a potential vehicular homicide investigation. And combined with Denise Okafor's willingness to testify about the pattern of intimidation, and Grace's letter, Mr. Reeves, I think we finally have enough to make this a fight Vance can't buy his way out of. Mia was crying, one hand pressed hard against her mouth, and Walter reached over without thinking and took her other hand in both of his, the way he might once have taken his own daughter's hand, and for a moment the 3 of them just sat there in that small municipal office letting 14 months and 8 years of grief finally have somewhere honest to go. Asterisk if this story has you feeling something right now, if some part of you is thinking about the people in your own life who deserve to hear, I forgive you, before it's too late, take a second and put it in the comments below. Tell us who you thought of. And if this is hitting you the way it's hitting us to tell it, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story find the people who need to hear it. Asterisk. Preston Vance did not take the news of a reopened investigation quietly. He came to Millbrook himself, 3 days later, driving the same black sedan that had idled at that crossroads 2 weeks earlier, except this time he didn't hide it. He parked directly in front of Reeves Auto Repair in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon and walked in wearing a suit that cost more than most of Walter's customers made in a month, and every single person in that shop stopped what they were doing the moment he walked through the door. He was younger than Walter expected. Late 30s, handsome in the practiced way of a man who'd never had to work for anything with his hands, and his smile when he found Walter standing at the counter was the smile of a man who had never once, in his entire life, believed he could actually lose. "Mr. Reeves," Preston said. "I think it's time we had that conversation face to face." Walter set down the wrench he'd been holding, slow and deliberate, and came around the counter. "There's a detective in Fort Wayne with your name in a file about my daughter's death," Walter said, his voice low and even in a way that carried more danger than shouting ever could. "There's a woman named Denise Okafor ready to testify about what you did to her family. And there's a letter my daughter wrote 18 months before you killed her, telling me exactly the kind of man you are. So no. We're done having conversations, Mr. Vance. Whatever you came here to say, you can say it to a judge." Something flickered across Preston's face, the first genuine crack Walter had seen, a flash of real fear beneath the polish, gone almost as fast as it appeared, replaced by a coldness that was somehow worse. "You have no idea what you've just done," Preston said quietly. "I have spent 14 months being patient. I have spent 14 months doing this the civilized way, through lawyers, through channels, because despite everything you clearly believe about me, I did not want it to come to this. That patience is now finished." "Is that a threat?" Walter asked. "It's a fact," Preston said, and straightened his jacket, and walked back out to his car without another word, and drove away down Millbrook's main street while every person in that shop watched him go with the particular held breath of a town that has just watched trouble arrive and drive off promising to come back. That night, at 2 a.m., Walter's phone rang with a call from Ruth Halloran, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Walter, there's a car parked outside my place, I don't recognize it, it's just sitting there." Walter was dressed and in his truck within 90 seconds, Mia beside him white-faced and silent, both of them understanding without saying it out loud that this was no longer a threat sitting somewhere in the abstract future. This was the storm finally breaking, right now, tonight, and Sophie was asleep in a house that Preston Vance had just proven he knew exactly how to find. But Sophie wasn't at Ruth's. She was at home. Walter had insisted, these past few nights, on keeping her close, in the room that still smelled like Grace, with Mia's cousin's old dog Biscuit curled protectively at the foot of the bed. Ruth's call had been about a different car, a different worry, but it didn't matter, because by the time Walter and Mia had confirmed Sophie was safe and turned the truck back toward Maple Street, sirens were already cutting through the dark 2 streets over, and Sheriff Danby's voice came crackling over Walter's phone, tense and urgent. "Walter, we've got him. Vance tried to access a private investigator's surveillance report on your property tonight, except the investigator he hired turned out to already be cooperating with Detective Cruz. Turns out even hired guns get nervous when vehicular homicide starts getting mentioned. We've got him on attempted tampering with a witness, obstruction, and Cruz says the homicide case is strong enough now to bring formal charges within the week. He's in custody, Walter. Tonight. It's over." Walter pulled the truck to the side of the road and sat there for a long moment, hands gripping the wheel, the words taking their time to land all the way through him. "It's over, 8 years of not knowing. 14 months of Mia running. Weeks of headlights in the dark and business cards on windshields and a threat that had followed a 5-year-old girl across 3 states. Over." Beside him, Mia was crying again, but differently this time, not the tight, controlled crying of a woman who has learned she can't afford to fall apart, but something looser, something that sounded almost like relief learning how to breathe again after 14 months of holding its breath. "She's safe," Mia said, half to herself, half to the windshield, half to a young woman 14 months gone who had made her promise this exact outcome from a hospital bed. "Walter. She's actually safe." The trial, when it finally came 7 months later, was not the Hollywood courtroom drama either of them had braced themselves for. It was slower than that, more exhausting, full of continuances and motions and the particular grinding patience the justice system demands of everyone who has to live through it. But Denise Okafor testified. Detective Cruz's evidence held. The phone records connecting Vance's associate to the delivery company's dispatch office proved impossible for even the most expensive legal team to fully explain away, and in the end, a jury in Fort Wayne found Preston Vance guilty of vehicular homicide, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering, and a judge who owed him nothing sentenced him to 22 years. Walter was in the courtroom the day the verdict came down. Mia sat beside him, and Sophie, 6 years old now, a little taller, a little braver, still carrying Bug everywhere though the rabbit had acquired a second missing button eye somewhere along the way, waited outside with Ruth Halloran, too young to be in that room but old enough, finally, to grow up somewhere the shadow of that black sedan would never reach again. When it was over, when the gavel had come down and the courtroom had begun to empty, Walter stood on the courthouse steps in the pale gray light of a Fort Wayne afternoon and, for the first time in 8 years, felt something in his chest that he almost didn't recognize anymore. Not happiness, exactly. Grief didn't work that way, didn't simply vanish because justice had finally arrived to do its slow, imperfect work. Grace was still gone. That would never change, not in this life or any other. But there was room now, for the first time in 8 years, for something to grow up alongside the grief instead of being smothered by it. Asterisk before we get to how this story ends, if you've made it this far, we'd love to know it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still finds its way back around, and tell us in the comments, what's the biggest lesson you're taking away from Walter and Grace's story? We read every single one, asterisk. Life in Millbrook settled, in the months that followed, into something Walter hadn't let himself imagine was still possible. Mia and Sophie stayed, not out of necessity anymore, not because there was nowhere else to run, but because somewhere in those 7 months of waiting for a trial, Maple Street had quietly stopped being a hiding place and started being home. Mia enrolled in community college 2 towns over, studying to become a paralegal, telling Walter one evening over dinner that watching Detective Cruz and the county prosecutor fight for Sophie's future had shown her, for the first time in her life, what she wanted to do with her own. Sophie started kindergarten that fall at Millbrook Elementary, and on the first day, when Walter drove her because Mia had an early class, Sophie turned to him in the truck with the particular seriousness only a 5-year-old about to start school can summon and asked him a question that undid him completely. Grandpa Walter, she said, she'd started calling him that 3 months earlier, the first time entirely her own idea, and every single time it landed in Walter's chest like a small, warm stone settling into a space that had been empty a long time. Do you think my first mama can see me today? Starting school and everything? Walter had to pull the truck over for a second before he could answer, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted to say it right. I don't know exactly how it works, where she is now, Walter said honestly. Nobody does, not really. But I'll tell you what I do know. Your mama loved you enough to send you and your mom Mia all the way here, to find me, so that you'd never have to grow up alone or scared. That kind of love doesn't just stop because somebody's not standing right in front of you anymore. I think she sees you, Sophie. I think she sees you every single day. And I think she's real proud of the brave girl you're turning into. Sophie nodded, satisfied in the way only children can be satisfied by an answer that adults spend a lifetime still searching for, and reached over to squeeze Walter's grease-stained hand with her small one. I'm glad you gave us breakfast that day, she said. Bug says thank you too. Walter laughed, really laughed, a sound that surprised him coming out of his own chest, a sound he hadn't made freely in longer than he wanted to count, and started the truck again, and drove his granddaughter to her first day of school past Ruthie's diner, past the booth by the window where an ordinary Tuesday morning 8 months earlier had quietly become the most important moment of the second half of his life. He still went to Ruthie's most mornings, still sat in that same booth, still turned his coffee cup in the same slow half-circle. But these days, more often than not, there was a booster seat pulled up beside him, and a little girl with her grandmother's stubborn chin drawing smiley faces in her pancake syrup, and a young woman across the table telling him about her latest exam grade like it was the most important news in the world, because to Walter, it was. He thought, some mornings, about how close he'd come to letting that Tuesday pass like every other one before it. How easy it would have been to keep his eyes on his own coffee, to let the bell over the door mean nothing the way it had meant nothing for 8 straight years, to let a young mother and her daughter sort out their breakfast in quiet dignity without a stranger's interruption. But he hadn't. He'd looked up. He'd paid for a meal that cost him $11.40, and it had given him back everything the world had taken from him and then, impossibly, more. That was the thing about kindness, Walter had come to believe, sitting in that booth morning after morning watching his granddaughter grow up safe and loud and entirely unafraid. It never announced itself as anything more than what it appeared to be in the moment, a small gesture, an ordinary decency, $11.40 that any decent person might have spent without a second thought. You never knew, when you reached out your hand to a stranger, whether you were simply being kind, or whether you were reaching back through time to catch a piece of everything you'd lost and pull it gently, finally, all the way home.